As I said, we are facing a difficult moment in Jewish history and human history, and sometimes it's good to step back a bit and to get some perspective by looking at something not related to current events. And ironically, this topic, which I chose many weeks ago, is related to current events. We're going to be talking about the question of Me Too in the Hebrew Bible. Me Too is a relatively recent innovation movement, but it is something that has been a universal human phenomenon for a long time. Many years ago, I did a review of the book The Red Tent. I don't know if you've heard of the book or seen the TV miniseries. It's a retelling of the story of the matriarchs, but from a woman's perspective, written by a woman author, Anita Diamant. And it is a very feminist retelling of the story. It highlights many contemporary feminist issues, from rape to contraception to abortion to all kinds of other topics, women's self-agency, earning a living, and so on. And when I gave the review, I said to my ear it sounded anachronistic, like out of time to be expressing these issues. And rightfully, somebody called me out on that and said, "You think these weren't issues? That this wasn't happening before 1970?" And the answer is, yes, it was happening. I just don't think people understood it in the same way. You know, that if there was spousal abuse, let's say, it was always terribly painful and upsetting for the people who experienced it. But if society said this is just the way things are, then your response would be different than in the world we're in today. So this is how these movements change society. They change what's acceptable, what's the window of possibility, both in the negative side, but also in the positive, openness side. So what we'll be talking about today are issues that the writers of the Hebrew Bible might not have thought of in this light. When they wrote that Eve's job is to obey her husband, as one of the punishments coming out of the Garden of Eden, they thought that was simply establishing a norm, and that was already in place. We read that now, seeing a problem with it that the authors might not have seen. So that's why I think it's okay to look back in the past and judge with our eyes, because it's what we do anyways. And if you believe in progress, the only way progress happens is by looking at what is or what was and saying it should be different. If you say, well, it's just the way it is, then nothing changes.
To measure some progress.
Right. You have to have some measurement of progress, and it's certainly useful to push back and make the change that way. So, Me Too in the Hebrew Bible. So first we have to give you a quick bit of background to the Me Too movement. The general principles behind it are that women can find empowerment through empathy. That is, if they share their own experience and they hear other people who've had a similar experience by saying, "Me too, I was also one of these people who suffered this," it becomes a movement and not just an individual episode where you blame yourself or ask a lot of questions about what you did wrong. And what it's turned into is women reporting their own sexual harassment and assault experiences, reporting men who have done these things, and it was not just a whisper network anymore. I sometimes will see people on social media who post a piece about how much they love Isaac Asimov and what a wonderful writer he was, and what wonderful things he did, and he was an active humanist for many years. He has a book in just about every section of the Dewey Decimal System, library catalog system, because he wrote on so many things. And he was a serial sexual harasser. And people don't talk about that. They said, don't get in an elevator with him. And women knew what that meant. But he was terrible. And it just takes a little bit of Googling to search and find a couple of long-form articles where people talk about this, finally. And so anytime I see someone post something about Isaac Asimov, about how wonderful he was, I say, well, yes, he was a wonderful writer, and this is part of the story. This is part of who he was, and it shouldn't be swept under the rug. Now, Me Too was actually started by a woman named Tarana Burke in 2006. She was a woman who worked with rape victims and sexual violence victims, and she said if everybody who had experienced something like this would only say Me Too, we would really change the world. Now, it became much more famous when Alyssa Milano, who's an actress, wrote a similar kind of message on her social media. I think it was Twitter at the time, and that was in 2017. And that really led to a lot of changes, at least in Hollywood. That's her field. But I think in many other areas as well. You know, we like to think that sexual harassment disappeared after the Anita Hill hearings and, you know, but no, that was the first time people had heard of this thing, or had heard of it possibly being a problem. But if you watched any episode of Mad Men, which is set in the 1960s, you can see what was the norm for women's treatment, and it was appalling. You know, the underlying goal of the movement is to change that culture of boys will be boys, and you just have to endure it. And no, it's also raised our awareness of the challenges of consent and power dynamics. You know, if someone is an employer versus an employee, or a supervisor versus an intern, or a professor versus a student, you know, that power dynamic affects the free choice involved in being involved in a relationship. You know, as one example, there have been people who've written essays saying they apologized to Monica Lewinsky because there were many feminist organizations that poo-pooed these accusations against Clinton by the Kenneth Starr using the Lewinsky experience, and she was vilified in many sources, including by people on the left who thought she was a gold digger or, you know, trying to make him. And it turns out she was in this dynamic, you know, this about the biggest power disparity you can imagine between the president of the United States and an intern at the White House. So I mean, she's come out of it. She's a wonderfully poised person. If you follow her writing or her media, it's really she's really come into her own. But there are people that owe her an apology for their response because we didn't understand this power dynamic factor, and that's something that Me Too has really changed.
It's one of the key elements in like safe sport. Like I'm the safe sport officer for Illinois for my sport, and one of the first things they talk about is unequal power relationships.
Right.
And when you have that is a red flag right away.
Right. And you know, this is unequal power relationships in a society where women have equal rights under the law, at least the letter of the law. Imagine an era before where women couldn't get credit cards in their own name if they were married, where women didn't have the right to own property in many states in the 19th century. They certainly didn't have the right to vote, right, until the 1920s, and that was only white women, not black women or Native American women. So there were all kinds of power disparities in a patriarchal system. Now go back 2,000 years to the era of the Hebrew Bible. Now you're really going to understand power disparity when it comes to the relationship between women and men. And the values of Me Too are focused in the other direction, on equality, on dignity, on women's autonomy, and ultimately on respect. You know, the goal is to have a relationship of equals and not this power dynamic being exercised on people's bodies and against them. So we'll take a look at, here's an example of a quotation about this. I think this is by, I can't remember if this is Tarana or Alyssa's phrasing. If all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And that was the ultimate motivation. So if we're talking about sexual harassment as well as sexual assault or an infringement on human dignity through the vehicle of sex, then it really is something we can apply to stories in the Hebrew Bible. This is actually going to be a two-part session. We have one today on the Torah, the first 5 books, the matriarchs and patriarchs, and then the one next time will be on the other sort of half of the Hebrew Bible, the books of the prophets and the writings. So here we have the creation story, and we don't think this is real history, of course, but this is the template that the society set for how things should run. In Genesis chapter 1, you have what sounds like a relatively even creation, because when it says God created man or humanity, the words are interchangeable in the Hebrew, Adam. When God created man in his own image, in God's image he created him, male and female he created them. So humanity is male and female, seemingly created at the same time, all part of one moment. And in our image, after our likeness. So both the male and the female are part of that initial creation in Genesis chapter 1, seemingly equal. But when you read Genesis chapter 2, it turns out very differently. Here you have man first and woman second. Man is formed from the dust of the ground. And then the God says, it's not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper comparable to him. He makes the man sleep. he takes one of his ribs or his side, he closes up the flesh, and he makes a woman from that rib, brings her to the man. He says she will be called Isha, woman, because she came out of Ish, out of man, so she's derivative, she's secondary, she's the helper. Therefore a man leaves his mother and father and joins his wife, they become one flesh. They were both naked and they were not ashamed. So here you have an unequal dynamic, but the nudity is not a problem. There's no, the sex isn't an issue yet. It takes all the way till chapter 3, which is the next chapter. The snake has convinced the woman to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She sees it's good for food, it's a delight to the eyes. The tree is desired to make you wise. It's a good idea to be smart. I want to learn. So she eats from the fruit. She gives some to her husband, and he eats it too. Their eyes are opened, and now here comes the sex. They both knew they were naked. So knowing good from evil, the very first thing they realize is not that the best system of laws has a checks and balances in different legislatures, or that I should do unto others as I would have them do unto me. No, the first thing they realize is I'm naked. So there's already a sort of puritanical, as we would say, obsession with nudity, sex, what's going to happen next.
And yet there was no one else to watch them.
Well, except each other.
Yeah, I know. But hey, you're married, right?
Well, but they didn't know what that meant.
Oh, okay.
So they sewed fig leaves together. They made coverings for themselves. They hear God walking in the garden. God says to man, "Where are you?" The man says, "I hid because I was naked." This is the classic when your kid gives himself away, by saying too much. He says, "I'm naked." And God says, "Who told you you're naked? Where did you find that out?" So he asks him, "Did you eat from the tree?" Look at the man's response.
Her fault.
Bus, wife, throw her under. The woman you
gave
the woman
some
you
your shrub, too.
Right, he's blaming both, right? Not taking responsibility. Lesson number 2 fail. Right? The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree and I ate it. So then he asks the woman, "What have you done?" She says, well, she also throws something under the bus. "The serpent deceived me and I ate." And so God issues the punishments. And he says to the woman, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. You will bear children in pain. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." So there's sort of 3 punishments here. Okay? Pain in childbirth. And this is sort of an origin story. Why do women have to have pain in childbirth? Well, here's why it's fair. Here's the justice. Secondly, your desire is for your husband. You'll want him. And third, he will rule over you. Now, some feminist readings of this story will point out this is the fallen state. This is after things get messed up. So ideally, in the perfect state, they were co-equal. They worked together. It started out fair. But now that they've eaten from this tree and broken the rules, now she's going to be suffering under his rule. And Adam is told, sorry, a question?
No.
Okay.
I think you could answer it.
Okay, so Adam is told, because you listened to your wife's voice and ate from the tree, which I said you shouldn't eat, the ground is cursed for your sake. You'll eat from it with much labor all the day. So the man has to work the fields. He has to create food from the fields. It's not going to come automatically. But notice the clause at the beginning. Because you listened to your wife's voice. Who's in charge in the ideal setting? The man's in charge. Listening to the wife's voice is already a mistake. In fact, the rabbis who read this story went even further. But before I do that, I want to tell you a positive myth that came out of this legend. If you go back to this Genesis chapter 1 creation, where they're both created at the same time, and then you have Genesis 2, where one comes after the other, you wonder, how does that make sense? Okay? Now, scholars of the Bible suggest that there were 2 different stories written at different times that were ultimately combined into this one document. You notice the name of the God is different. One is just God, and one is Yahweh God, or Adonai God, you'd say in traditional Hebrew. So you can see that there's some difference in the story that way too. Also, the one in chapter 1 he just says, "Let there be," and it happens. In chapter 2 he forms man from the dust of the ground like a potter with clay. So it's much more hands-on God than just let it say God. So that's one theory, that it's different stories. Some rabbis also say it's just a detail. Chapter 1 is the overview, and chapter 2 is the detail of what happens on day 6. But option 3 was to imagine that there were actually 2 creations. There was creation 1A, that was with Adam and someone else. And then there's creation 1B, which is Adam out of the rib to make Eve. Now, who is that someone else in 1A? It's a character who's described as Lilith. Lilith is understood to be a demon. You can hear from her name. Lilith in Hebrew is related to the word Lila, which means night. And she's often characterized as an owl, again, a nocturnal animal. But the theory is that Lilith was co-created with Adam and insisted on being equal, even to the point of wanting to be on top during sex sometimes, which was, of course, that's a problem. So she was told she needed to submit to Adam. She refused to do this, and they said, well, if you don't do this, we will kill 1 million of your demon children every day. And she said, I don't care. She said the divine name and flew off and became a demon that hates humanity and all of its children, and sometimes will tempt a man into sin. This is nocturnal emissions, causing men to ejaculate overnight and spill their seed, which they're not supposed to do, and tries to kill human children. That's crib death or stillbirth. And in fact, there are all these amulets that we found archaeologically that Jews made in the Middle Ages to try to ward off Lilith, that they would put in their cribs with the babies, because they were worried Lilith was going to come and kill them. In an era where crib death was not uncommon, that was a real concern for them, even if their response is not how we would respond. So Lilith is this character that rejects inequality, is painted out as a demon, but has some positive characteristics in standing up for herself. And that's why when a Jewish feminist magazine was started in the 1970s, it was called Lilith Magazine. And when in the 1990s, a bunch of women-led rock groups wanted to tour because they were told women couldn't headline their own tours, they called it the Lilith Fair. It was reclaiming this character of Lilith from the story. So it's not in the Hebrew Bible per se, it's in rabbinic legend that comes out of it, and they paint her as a demon. But sometimes if we're retelling the story in our own way, you can reclaim her as something else. But the mainstream rabbinic tradition looked at this creation story and saw it as an example of what not to do, especially for women. So when God was about to make Eve, let me move this down here. When God was about to make Eve, he said, I will not make her from the head of man, lest she carry her head high in arrogant pride. Not from the eye, lest she be wanton-eyed, slutty. And not from the ear, lest she be an eavesdropper. Not from the neck, lest she be insolent. Not from the mouth, lest she be a tattler. This is answering why the rib. Not from the hand, lest she be a meddler. Not from the foot, lest she be a gadabout, a loose woman. I will form her from a chaste portion of the body. Hear the emphasis on sex again? And to every limb and organ as he formed it, God said, be chaste, be chaste. Nevertheless, in spite of the great caution used, woman has all the faults God tried to eliminate. The daughters of Zion were haughty and walked with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes. Sarah was an eavesdropper in her own tent when the angel spoke with Abraham. Miriam was a talebearer accusing Moses. Rachel was envious of her sister Leah. Eve put out her hand to take the forbidden fruit. And Dinah was a loose woman. We'll learn more about Dinah a bit later. So it's all their fault, right? They did all the bad things. Even though God tried his best to keep them good, they went bad, and Eve was one of them. And it even goes into more detail about what women should or should not do in society based on this original story. Many of the differences between the two sexes are attributed to the fact that man was formed from the ground and woman from bone. Remember that chapter 2? Women need perfumes, while men do not. I don't know what men they're talking about. But.
Yeah.
Dust of the ground remains the same no matter how long it is kept, but flesh requires salt to keep in good condition. A man is easily placated, not so a woman. A woman covers her hair in token of Eve's having brought sin into the world. She tries to hide her shame. So if you've seen women in Orthodox communities that wear what's called a sheitel or a covering on their hair, that's partly... Now, this is maybe finding a new reason for an old practice,
Yeah, that's
but it's also justifying the practice based on this kind of misogynistic reading of the story. And women precede men in a funeral cortege because it was woman who brought death into the world.
Now, where is this coming from?
These are from rabbinic commentaries
Okay.
on the original story. So it's not in the Hebrew Bible itself, it's in how the rabbis read them.
Okay. So that's what that name is done.
The citation, yes, Bereshit or Genesis Rabbah is a collection of rabbinic stories about the story, or retellings, or interpretations. And then they ask, why was the rule of menstruation given to Eve? Because she shed the blood of Adam, therefore she has her blood shed. Adam was the challah offering of the world, and Eve defiled it. And so in atonement, women have to take the challah piece away from the dough when they bake bread and burn that up as an offering. And because women extinguish the light of man's soul, she is bidden to kindle the Sabbath light. So this is talking about these 3 commandments that are especially assigned to women. Rules of nidah, or menstrual impurity, rules of challah, taking the dough as they're baking it and burning it up, and lighting Shabbat candles, which are traditionally women's job to do. There's a sinister side to this list of 3, though. Not to mention that they're all domestic and, they're
Mention sounds sinister.
public.
Hearing it.
Right, it's bad enough to start. It gets worse. So
It gets worse.
What do you mean that this is the good side?
these 3 commandments assigned to women are also given as the reason why women die in childbirth. If they're not careful with menstruation laws, if they're not careful with the challah offering, if they're not careful with lighting Shabbat candles, the punishment could be to die in childbirth. I mean, can you imagine a worse scenario? Dying in childbirth? And then the guilt is added, it was her fault. Because she wasn't being careful with these things that were assigned to her. This is the world of rabbinic law in some areas. If you read the tractates on women, or the tractates on ketubas and how you acquire women in marriage, I mean, it gets offensive easily. Now in this case, I'm trying to focus on the stories, the narratives, and it's important to remember that the rabbi's Eve is not the Jewish feminists' Eve. When Jewish feminists take these stories and retell them, they make them very different. Eve becomes a heroine. She sought knowledge. She broke an unjust law. And she wanted to include her husband in it. What would happen if Eve and Lilith met? What if they got along? What if they shared their stories with each other and became sisters? The world could be very different. So the stories get very different. Stories are malleable. The myths are these archetypes, but we can retell those stories in our own way. The rabbis told it with a particular direction, with their agenda. They had to explain a problem. If God is just, why would women die in childbirth? It must be they must have done something. And maybe they draw on this Eve story to find the things they must have done to cause that to happen. The rabbis couldn't just say bad things happen. They have to happen for a reason. And the reason has to be you did something, because there's justice in the world. And so they give the justice this way. Now, there are plenty of other stories problematic. We've only gotten to chapter 3 in Genesis, right? We've got a long way to go. We're not going to do everything, but I wanted to highlight just a couple other examples of the mistreatment of women in these narratives. So here we have the story of hiding your wife as your sister, which actually happens a few times in the Torah narratives. Now, why would you say that your wife was your sister? Well, maybe you'll be afraid of what's going to happen to you if they think she's your wife. There was a famine in the land of Canaan, and so Abram went down into Egypt to live as a foreigner there. When he came to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "See now, I know that you are a beautiful woman to look at. It will happen when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' They will kill me, but save you alive. Please say that you are my sister. It will be well with me for your sake, and my soul may live because of you." So to save my life, I'll call you my sister. But if she's just his sister, that means she's available.
Right.
She's not married.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
So she has no protection.
Right. So when Abraham had come into Egypt, they saw she was beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh saw her and praised her, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house.
And what does that mean?
He dealt well with Abraham for her sake. "I like your sister. Let me give you some things. Sheep, cattle, male servants, female servants, etc." However, Pharaoh was afflicted with great plagues because of Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called to Abram and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she was my sister so that I took her to be my wife?" Uh-oh. So is he being afflicted preemptively? Or did he take her to wife with all that implies? And now he's being punished for adultery because he's taken someone who was already promised to someone else. And he said, what's happening? And then he realizes what happened.
So Abram was kind of a pimp.
So is Abraham pimping? It's a problematic reading of the story. Take your wife, go your way. And so they sent him away with all of his people. Now, I'll point out that rabbis saw this story when they were reading it, and they didn't like the implications. And so they come up with their own stories about this story, saying that maybe she had her time of the month when she went there, and so they didn't touch her for a month, and then Pharaoh had a vision, and so he never actually slept with her, or maybe that plague hit right away before anything happened that shouldn't have happened. And so they find ways to work around the narrative so that their understanding of the story doesn't include any violations of their sanctities as they understand them. And this pattern repeats itself again in Genesis chapter 20, where Abraham meets another king whose name is Abimelech, and there it says explicitly that God tells Abimelech, don't touch her, she's Abraham's wife. And the narrator says, and he didn't touch her at all. Now in this story it doesn't say that. It doesn't have an explicit message from God. It doesn't have an explicit statement by the narrator that there was no touching involved. So you might infer from that maybe there was touching in this story and there wasn't touching in the Abimelech episode.
Yeah, I didn't see it broken down like this, obviously, but I remember when I was a kid seeing the story, thinking this is the exact opposite. Like if you had your sister with you, you might say she was your wife to protect her from other men. But he was protecting himself.
Ah, that's the thing. Who's being protected here?
Yeah, no, I mean, he gave her up for him.
Yeah. Well, he rented her.
Please say that you are my sister.
Right. This also happens with Isaac and his wife Rebekah in Genesis 26, a similar kind of, my wife is my sister, and then she gets taken, and then there's a plague, and then she gets returned. But this is a pattern that, maybe people in a weak position, after all, Abraham and Isaac they're patriarchs in this story, but they're small potatoes against Pharaoh and Canaanite kings. It's a strategy for protection, and as we know, unfortunately, sometimes power is exercised on women's bodies. It's not, simply a man-to-man kind of debate. Now, a third challenge has to do with the narrative of Jacob and his wives. Now, Jacob is Isaac's son, Abraham's grandson. He goes away to his uncle's home to try to find a wife. He falls in love with Rachel, the youngest one, and that unfortunately is a problem. Jacob is speaking with shepherds at a well, and Rachel comes with her father's sheep. When he saw Rachel, he was so transported, he rolled the stone from the well's mouth, which it took several shepherds to roll, so sort of possessed with a supernatural power. And then he kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice, and he wept. He told Rachel he was her father's relative, he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Now, it doesn't say he asked her if he could kiss her, but, there's some romantic license in, getting swept up in the moment, and okay, fine. There's also some debates about Rachel's age at the time, whether she was a minor or not, but as we know, concepts of minor exemption from sexual activity was not something that's practiced in the ancient world and in some parts of this world, to be honest. In parts of Afghanistan and Africa, that's still, child marriage is still practiced. Now it points out here that Laban had two daughters. The older daughter was Leah. The name of the younger daughter was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and attractive, and Jacob loved Rachel. What do you think love means there?
Lust.
Well, do we have to be so anti-romantic? Yeah. Was it only lust? Well, he just met her.
Infatuated.
Right.
But
And it was because she was beautiful.
And she was beautiful, that's right. Does he know about her character? Does he know about it? No. This is a case where I can see both sides. Where you're writing a fairy tale, you fall in love at first sight, right? That happens. Some enchanted evening, right? You meet a stranger across a crowded room, and then somehow you know even then that you'll see them again and again. This is South Pacific. So
I think we all got that.
Yeah, in case anybody doesn't online. Anyways, the point is that that idea of romantic love at first sight, that's a motif in Western literature, so I'm willing to cut them a little bit of slack on that. But notice that they have to denigrate Leah by saying her eyes are weak, whatever that means. This is a case, again, where retelling the story, you can do things differently. So in Anita Diamant's version, The Red Tent, she says, some silly tales that men told about my family said that Leah's eyes were weak, but that's not true at all. In fact, her eyes were so strong that she made men weak, and that's why they wrote this lie about her in the story. That's how Diamant retells the story, okay? Now, the rabbis interpreted this to say that her eyes were weak because she had been promised to Esau, Jacob's older brother. And Esau was rough and crude and a hunter and a boor, and so she cried her eyes out, imagining she was going to have to marry him, and that's why her eyes are described here as weak. Not that she was inherently less attractive. However, when you have this comparison in the original Hebrew, Leah's eyes were weak, Rachel was beautiful in form and attractive. Well, there's clearly A and B in that. And again, it's judging by the surface, you know. Laban's response to this question of, I want to work for you to earn your daughter, is, it's better that I give her to you than I give her to someone else. You know, you're better than a stranger.
Yeah, it's pretty.
But also notice the language.
Praise.
I give her to you.
Yeah, it's possession.
It's a possession.
Yeah, no one's asking Rachel.
No one's asking Rachel.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if Rachel kissed him back.
yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, it could be like that famous picture of VE Day, where the nurse is getting kissed by the sailor, but her body language suggests that she's not particularly into this. But everyone thinks this is a wonderful romantic moment, but she's not actively participating in that. It's you know, it's a immortalized sexual assault, as we would describe it. So here you have an example of property. I mean, even the giving of a ring, by the way, at a Jewish wedding is an echo of that. In traditional Jewish weddings, the ring is only given from the groom to the bride. It's not given to the groom. It's a symbol of the purchase price. And then she accepts it by moving it to her ring finger. So there's echoes of this even in modern Jewish practice, but certainly not in our sort of liberal ethics of what women get to choose to do. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. They seemed to him a few days because of the love he had for her. Now, I mean, this begins to sound like actual love if you're willing to hold off for 7 years and work. And, you know, it begins to have a bit of a romantic side to it. Mm-hmm. And so Jacob says to his uncle, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, so I may go into her. This is the euphemism in biblical language. He gathered together his men, he made a feast, but he took Leah, his older daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And he gave Zilpah to his daughter Leah for a servant. So now Jacob thought he was marrying Rachel, the younger beautiful daughter, but he was given Leah, and he had intercourse with her. In the morning, behold, it was Leah. He said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? Didn't I serve you for Rachel? And Laban says, well, this is not how we do it here, to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill the week of this one, and I'll give you the other one also, which you'll serve for another 7 years. And so he did so. He fulfilled the week with Leah, and then he got Rachel as a wife, and she got a maidservant. He also went into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. And they served for another 7 years. So here you have sister wives. I mean, in fact, later biblical legislation will say a man is not allowed to marry two sisters, at least simultaneously. But it is a world that clearly accepts polygamy, and we know that many societies with polygamy are bad news for women's rights, autonomy, and respect. And it's clearly differentiating based on looks, and the patriarchal system, the father decides. Nobody asks Leah what she wants to do in that circumstance. Again, the rabbis interpret this to say, well, she wanted it because the alternative was Esau, and he was terrible, so she'd prefer to be with Jacob.
Never heard of that Esau part of it.
Yeah. In fact, they even imagine that that Jacob had worked out a special hand signal with Rachel to make sure it was the right person coming into the tent, but then Rachel felt bad for her sister, so she taught her the hand signal so that they could fool Jacob. And so, again, interesting retellings of the story behind it. But the core story is a patriarchal story of the uncle assigning the older one. And then notice the servants they become important too. Leah is very fertile, even though she's not loved. She gives 4 sons very quickly. But Rachel has no children. And so Rachel is jealous of her sister. She says to Jacob, "Give me children or else I will die." And Jacob says, "Who do you think I am, God? I can't control this. I'm trying really hard. There's only so much I can do." And so here she says, "Behold my maid Bilhah. Go into her that she may bear on my knees, and I may also obtain children by her." And so she gave Bilhah, the servant, as a wife to Jacob, and Jacob went into her. He's very obliging. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob. Now, what did Bilhah think about this?
Who cares? She's
Who
a
knows?
servant.
She's a woman and a servant,
And a
right?
slave, yeah.
And a slave, exactly. Now, what's funny is I mentioned this in a online discussion group once, and someone said, that sounds a lot like the plot of The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood.
Really?
And I said to her, well, guess where Margaret Atwood got it? In fact, they even quote this passage in the Bible when the birth is happening in Gilead. It's where she got the ideas, from this universe of handmaids who are made to bear upon the knees, right? As if it's like the one who's in labor is leaning back on the stomach of the woman of whose child it will really be. And who gets to name it? Notice, she gave a son, and Rachel called the name of the son Dan. The servant conceived again, bore a second son, and Rachel names the son Naphtali. So this is a surrogate. This is a war bride. This is not an autonomous agent, Bilhah. In fact, when you list the traditional matriarchs, you have Rebecca, you have Sarah from those earlier generations, and you have Leah and Rachel. You traditionally do not include Zilpah and Bilhah, even though they are technically the mothers of many tribes. But they were servants, so they don't count. And then notice that she was done bearing, so she took Zilpah, her servant, and gave her to Jacob. And Jacob's very obliging again.
Jacob's such a...
He's got his nice harem. And she gives Jacob a son too, twice. And names him Gad and Asher. So here you have these handmaids used to create peoples. But there's a precedent earlier, by the way. Abraham does the same thing. Because when Sarah can't have a child, she gives him Hagar, her servant. He has a child with them, with Hagar, named Ishmael. And ultimately they get expelled because when Sarah has her own child, she wants nothing to do with this handmaid's child and kicks him out. In this case, they're included in the line of the patriarchs. These become the ancestors of the 12 tribes. But again, a world where you can take servant girls and just hand them off to
And then claim
the Lord, and then claim the children as your. I mean, this is Me Too Deluxe. So now here's another story that does definitely get into issues of sexual violence. The story of Dinah. Dinah is a daughter of Leah. A daughter? Oh, because we had all sons before. They often don't talk about the daughters. It's one of those, again, solving the problem issues. Who are Adam and Eve's children? They have Cain and Abel, except Abel gets killed. And they have Seth. And Cain goes out and finds a wife. Where? From where? In Inherit the Wind, they joke, did someone pull a creation in the next county, and that's how they found the wife? Well, the rabbis, in their wisdom, said, well, whenever she gave birth to twins or triplets. And they just had sisters they didn't mention. Solves the problem, right? Well, unless you know anything about genetics.
Cain's sister.
Yeah, but this is pre-genetics, right? It doesn't matter. It's all mythology. You got talking snakes. I mean, come on. So we can be flexible.
Talking snakes with arms.
Right, right. That don't crawl on their bellies. So, in any case, in the Dinah story, we'll see how here's a daughter that is mentioned, but she's mentioned for unfortunately a negative reason, and even her name, Dinah. The word din in Hebrew means judge or justice or judgment. So Dinah, whom she bore to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her. He took her, lay with her, and humbled her. His soul joined to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young lady and spoke kindly to her. Now, in this case, notice that he lays with her first and loves her second, but he's attached to her, and he speaks kindly to her. And so he says to his father, get me this young lady as a wife. It's a little bit, horse is already out of the barn, but at least he's trying to make it right. And so then his father has to deal with the problem, because Jacob heard that Dinah had been defiled. Now, one of the questions in this is the defiling a rape, or is the defiling the fact that he had sex with her at all? Because as it comes out, these Canaanites are not circumcised. And so maybe it's the fact that it was an outsider that did this, that was the pollution, and that's the humbling, as opposed to that he raped her or did something, demeaning to her. Jacob was quiet until the sons came back from the field, and Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to talk to him. Her brothers were very grieved and very angry because of what he had done, a thing that ought not to be done, lying with Jacob's daughter. And so Hamor said, the soul of my son longs for your daughter. Give him to her as a wife. Make marriages with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yours. You'll dwell with us, live in it, trade and get. He wants to coexist. He wants to mix and blend. Now, in a world where it says only marry within the tribe, go all the way back to your ancestral homeland to find a wife, as Jacob had to do, to find Rachel and Leah. He couldn't just marry someone local, which Esau did and got in trouble for. Well, now that he's talking about polluting. So Shechem directly said to her father and brothers, let me find favor in your eyes. Whatever you tell me, I will give. Ask me a great amount for a dowry, whatever you ask, but give me the young lady as a wife. So again, could you read this as a romance story? Could you read this as a rapist trying to make good? Well, the rabbis read this as a rapist trying to make good. But Anita Diamant in the Red Tent read it as a Harlequin romance. If you read her description of Shechem, it's like she's describing Fabio. I mean, he doesn't even have hair on his chest, which I find appallingly inaccurate for the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's just not realistic. But the point is that he's gorgeous, and she loves him, and she wants to be with him in that retelling of it by Anita Diamant. But in this version, it's clearly a violation. And so the men answered with deceit, because he had defiled Dinah. Again, it's defiling is the language that's used. Saying, we can't do this thing, give our sister to one uncircumcised, only on this condition. If you circumcise every male, then we'll give our daughters to you, and vice versa, we'll become one people. But if you don't do it, then we'll take our sister and take off. Their words pleased them. The young man didn't wait to do it, he did it right away. They came to the city, and they said to all these men, let's do it. They have a lot of possessions, this will be good for us. So let's give our consent, they'll live with us. So is this negative? Are they trying to acquire all the goods and animals of the Jacob clan? Maybe. But they're also willing to circumcise themselves to make one people. And they all did it. And on the third day, when they were sore, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, took their sword, came upon the unsuspecting city, and killed all the males. Now these are Dinah's full brothers, because they're also from Leah. They have the same father and the same mother. Notice there are a lot of half-siblings in this clan, because you've got the kids of the handmaids, and you've got Rachel's kids that come later.
Cousin siblings.
So there's other cousin siblings, half-siblings, it's all over the place. In this case, her full brothers came with their swords, and they kill all the males. And they take Dinah out of Shechem's house, and they go away. Now, what does Dinah think of this? Well, we don't know. We don't have her voice. If it was the Harlequin romance, she was swept off her feet and it was wonderful, obviously she would have been appalled at this. If it was a rape, she might have still had a problem with this. Because in some cases, and we'll see in some of the legislation in the Hebrew Bible, the only alternative for a raped woman was to marry the rapist. That's what made it good. And that was the case, by the way, in medieval European practice and law too. That the solution to a rape was it's like a shotgun wedding. You marry them and make it good ex post facto. So maybe the only person who would take her at this point would be Shechem. And now they've killed him and his whole family. So we don't know what she would have thought. They plundered the city. They took captive all their little ones and their wives and took his plunder. So they did take their daughters, right? But they take them as war brides, as captives. Notice also, by the way, it doesn't say they converted them right away. This is the patriarchal era of Jewish identity. where you can capture non-Jewish women, they become part of your household. You can even create children with them that will be Jewish, because it's the father that defines it. It's not the matriarchal identity that we find in later Jewish practice. But in this era, it's power of the sword and power of the man.
How did they reconcile that with Ezra, who's saying that you can't, you know?
Well, of course, he took him to the local rabbi and put her in the mikveh, and then she converted. I mean, that's how you reconcile it. Duh. And notice, Jacob says, you made trouble with me. He doesn't say you did a terrible thing. He says, now, oh, what a headache you've given me, because these other people are going to attack me. And the response of Simeon and Levi was, should he deal with our sister like a zonah, like a prostitute? So there's a world where there are prostitutes, there's whores, there's loose women, and our daughter should be treated with respect. Our sister should be treated with respect. And she wasn't. So this is a case where, again, we don't hear the woman's voice. We don't know if this was a romance or a rape. It could be that their response was the correct response. That she was raped and she was taken captive, and they liberated her and they killed the people who did the crime. But it's one of these ambiguous stories because we don't hear what Dinah has to say. And you can retell the story differently. In fact, in another story, it's an irony with this last line about a prostitute, Judah, who's another one of the 12 brothers, has his own problem with a daughter-in-law because his daughter-in-law Tamar marries one of his sons and he dies. And she marries another one of his sons and he dies. And then he's supposed to marry her to a third son, and he says, no, I don't want her to kill the third one. You know, 2 strikes and you're out. But then she's sort of left in limbo as this widow who has no protector and no household. So she disguises herself as a prostitute and seduces Judah, and he leaves a token of his identity with her as a pledge. And then people who saw this come to him and say, you know, your daughter-in-law is playing the prostitute out here. And so he says, she should be burned. And then she says, well, the person who prostituted with me is the guy who owns this staff. And Judah says, uh-oh. So he says, she was right and I was wrong. But what you hear in these stories are women trying to make their way in a world that is so limited for them. They need the protection of others. There's a reason why there's all these laws in the later legislation of the Hebrew Bible of widows and orphans need to be cared for, and widows and orphans need to glean from the fields, and widows and orphans need to be protected. It's because they don't have any protection. It's because they don't have any assets or income. They can't own the land. It goes to a male heir. So the problem is that it's a world where women have no rights and no power, and these women are making their way as best they can through stories written by men. And so that's what makes these characters so problematic and these narratives. Going down another generation, we have the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Joseph, you remember, is one of the 12 children of Jacob. He gets sold into slavery by his brothers who are jealous. He's taken down into Egypt. He's made a servant in the home of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officers. He's well-built and handsome, you'll notice, at the end of this passage. And so Potiphar's wife decides she wants to sleep with him. Maybe power dynamics also work from powerful women to less powerful men. She says, lie with me. He refuses. He says, my master has trusted me with everything, and I'm not going to do this great wickedness. You're his wife. He didn't listen to her to lie with her or be with her. Around this time, he went into the house to do his work, and there were no men inside. So she grabbed his garment and said, lay with me. He left the garment with her and ran outside. And so she calls to the men of the house and lies. Behold, this Hebrew came in to humble me, to mock us. He came in to lie with me. I cried out with a voice, and he left his garment and ran outside. So the moral of the story is, Hebrews are virtuous, and women lie. You know, this is one of the responses that we've heard even today to the Me Too movement, is women lie. And it would be wrong to say that women never lie. We know that women are people. And if you've had a teenager, you know that people lie. But they're not all lying. And when people say it's a he said, she said, and it becomes a he said, she said, she said, she said, she said, she said, she said, then you begin to think it's not just women are lying. But this story is one where you have a sexual assault, in this case toward the man, but the woman's lying about it. And so the lesson you might take is that women might lie about sexual assault to get revenge, right? Or to simply punish somebody. So we'll take a look at a few examples in maybe the next 10 minutes or so, and then wrap up. So this is an example from Numbers chapter 5. If a man's wife goes astray and commits a trespass against him by sleeping with someone else, a man lies with her carnally, it's hidden from the eyes of her husband, and she's defiled, and there's no witness since she was not caught in the act, and the spirit of jealousy comes upon him, and he's jealous of his wife, or if the spirit of jealousy comes upon him and she is not defiled, that he's just jealous irrationally, he brings his wife to the priest, and he brings her offering for her. He charges her by an oath, and he says, if no man is lain with you, and you've not gone astray to uncleanness with another instead of your husband, be free from the bitter water that causes the curse. But if you have gone astray, and you are defiled, and some man is lain with you other than your husband, then you'll be cursed. The Lord will make a curse and an oath among you, cause your bowels to swell and your thigh to fall away. And the woman says, amen, amen. So this is like an examination. She's suspected of having slept around, and now they're going to test. This is like the witch test, do you float or sink? This is the whore test. What happens to you when you drink this special potion? And when he made her drink the water, it will come to pass that if she is defiled, and the water that causes the curse enters into her, then it becomes bitter. Her belly swells, her thigh falls, she's a curse among the people. But if she's not defiled and is clean, then she is free, and she conceives seed. Now, the irony of this is, if she'd fooled around with somebody, she's more likely to get pregnant. But in this case, the prize of having been falsely accused in front of everybody, but being shown by God to have done it, is that you get to have a child. You conceive a child.
In pain.
Yes, right. This is the Torah of jealousies. When a wife goes astray with another man instead of her husband and is defiled, or when the spirit of jealousy comes upon him, and sets the woman before the Lord, and he executes upon her this, thus shall the man be guiltless from sin, and the woman shall bear her sin. Now, notice here, is there a procedure for the man committing adultery? No. What's the concern with adultery? The parentage of the child. You want to know you always know who the mother is. You want to know who the father is. And the only way you can do that is to make sure that she has only slept with this one person. But a man can have more than one wife. We've already seen it, right? Moses does it. Abraham did it. Jacob certainly did it. Well, if you can have more than one wife, then the adultery issue is less of an issue for the man, because you just call her a wife. In fact, in Egypt, even to this day, they have this phenomenon of like temporary wives, where you marry someone for like a week, and then you divorce her, and that's a way of getting around adultery provisions. Or at least that was the case some decades ago. I don't know if that's still the case there, but it's one of these cases of using the rules to get what men want. Well, here's another case. If the woman is thought to have fooled around, there's a whole procedure, and that causes her severe consequence. If the man's thought to fool around, unless he fooled around with another man's wife, but it's the violation of the other man's rights, not the status of the woman. So that's one example. Here's another example. Slavery. We've already seen how servants are treated poorly. Well, here's worse. If a man sells his daughter to be a slave, all right, so we don't have to get much further than that. If a man sells his daughter to be a slave, she does not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he lets her be redeemed. She can be freed. So if he wants to marry her and is like betrothed, like engaged to her, but he decides not to keep her, then she has to be freed. He cannot sell her to a foreign people. And if he betrothed her to his son, again, he betrothed her to the son. She has no voice in this. He has to deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, so if he gotten her as a servant and then he adds another wife to the harem, he shall not diminish her food or clothing or her marriage rights. And if he doesn't do these three for her, she goes out free without paying money. So these are ways to get a female slave out of slavery if she's not treated like the proper slave bride that she's supposed to be. Again, people might point to this and say, oh, look how progressive, look at all these ways out. But Understand the setup here. The framework is so objectionable. Here's an example in Leviticus. As for your male and your female slaves, whom you may buy from the nations around you, from those you buy male and female slaves. You don't buy slaves from Hebrews, according to Leviticus. You buy the slaves from the non-Jews around you. Those you can buy forever. And the children of the aliens who live among you, you buy, and their families with you. You can make them an inheritance for your children after you. And the families that they produce, that they conceive in your land, they're your property. This is what's called chattel slavery, right? And there's a reason why there was so much rape in this American South under slavery, because if you could produce more slaves from the slave woman, you had more slaves and more value and more property, and it was an investment.
And you didn't have to buy them.
And you didn't buy them, you grew them at home.
Homegrown.
Right. I mean, again, this is obnoxious, appalling, unethical, and the Torah. This founding legislation. Again, people will try to find passages in here to say this is softening what could have been happening elsewhere. This is timeless law. And thank goodness we take the approach that it's not binding anymore. Because this kind of chattel slavery is terrible.
Except it's still on the books in a lot of states in the U.S.
Oh, chattel slavery?
Chattel, women and children as chattel.
There are certainly some areas that need addressing in the law. The other challenge is that the attitude is there, even if the law isn't, right? So over your brothers, the children of Israel, do not rule this way with harshness, but from the outside people you can. And that attitude of how you treat the outside people versus the inside people, again, is an ethical problem.
And you can see those slave owners in America using this as justification.
Right, absolutely. They read the Bible.
And their wives weren't very thrilled about it,
Right,
Yeah.
right.
as you can
But who
imagine.
cares?
So here's another example. War brides. When the Hebrews are conquering the land of Israel, Moses tells them, be armed for war to go against Midian to execute judgment. They killed every male. They took the women of Midian captive with their little ones, and all their livestock, their flocks, and their goods they took as plunder. All their encampments they burned with fire. So again, the women are taken into the tribe, even the little ones are taken into the tribe, and they become what we would call a war bride. Now Moses is angry with the officers. He says to them, have you saved all the women alive? These caused the children of Israel to sin against Yahweh. We had to face a plague because there was a Midianite woman who was sleeping with a Hebrew man in the tent of meeting. Now, therefore, says Moses, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known a man by lying with him. But all the girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Again, a patriarchal system, non-Jewish women can produce Jewish children, but you want to make sure
They're yours.
they're yours. And so any woman who is laying with a man at risk of polluting the bloodline, all the males of the little ones, wipe them out because they'll grow up to kill you. It's brutal. It's what today we would call a genocide, right? Where you wipe out the line of these people and consume the women in your rape factory system. Now, Deuteronomy offers another version of the story. When you go out to battle against your enemies, and Yahweh your God delivers them, and you take away captives, and see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you were attracted to her, and desired to take her as your wife, then you bring her home to your house. She shaves her head and trims her nails. She takes off the clothing in her captivity, and remains in your house, bewailing her father and mother for a full month. After that you shall go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife.
How nice for her.
Yeah, how nice for her, right? No consent, no request. Why give her a full month?
To make sure that she's not pregnant.
Yes, that's right.
It has nothing to do with.
It's not
mourning
kindness.
her mother and-
It's not mourning her father. Yeah, because she could do that in 2 weeks. She could do it in 3 months. I mean, why pick 1 month? Well, maybe it's again that purity of the line.
I'm sure you go to the next one.
Yes, and again, what choice does she have? None. Now, again, the rabbis reading this sometimes have softened this. They give her an out to be able to refuse it. They say it was very unlikely that he was going to do this. Having to wait for a month is so that he sort of calms down his passion, so that he's not just jumping into bed with her on day one, and then he can reconsider. Again, they try to find ways to soften these original laws, but they can't go back in and say, forget this law. We cancel this law. There's no amending the Torah. You can comment on it, you can interpret it, but you can't just strike a passage. Again, we as secular Jews can say we reject this, that we're allowed to do that, but those who follow a system of halakha have to find ways to work around that. And if you have no delight in her, then you let her go where she desires, but you do not sell her for money. You can't deal with her as a slave because you made her your wife, so now she's free if you don't want her anymore, and you divorce her just like anybody else. And by the way, to give the Bible a little bit of credit, it does have a provision for divorce. There are plenty of religious traditions that don't. But the Torah says that if a man finds something not pleasing in the woman, he can write her a book of divorcement or a bill of divorcement and hand it to her, and she is divorced.
But then she has nothing.
Then, well, this is where the idea of the ketubah came in. Because the original ketubah was what she was entitled to in case of a divorce or if he died as part of his estate. It was sort of a safety net. Given the circumstance of not owning property and then getting divorced and then she'd be with nothing, by Bible laws, the rabbis added the ketubah idea to give her some financial security and to give the man a disincentive to divorcing her because then he has to give her this money. So that's one of the ways, again, the rabbis worked in the right direction. They softened what in the Torah could have been a harsh possibility of divorce with no safety net. They added at least a safety net and a disincentive to divorce. So there are times that it's gone in the right direction.
And is that why a man has to throw it at you?
Oh, the get?
Yeah.
Well, he has to provide it to you directly, and you have to receive it. So that's why you have to be present at the same time, or have an agent to do it for you. There's all kinds of laws around that. So notice that the idea is they thought, well, maybe this will make him not want to marry her because he has to wait so long, but, not so great. And then this is maybe one of the worst ones. If you thought it wasn't bad before, the last one we'll look at is this one, about what happens after a rape. If a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both die. The man who lay with the woman and the woman. Adultery, right? Violating the right of the father. At least it's even.
No, there's another paragraph.
Well, he's still got a slide
something
there.
else.
We got a lot of
There's
slides.
still a lot of white space there.
Yes. If there is a young lady who is a virgin pledged to be married, so she's engaged, pledged to be married to a husband, and the man finds her in the city and lies with her there, you bring them both out to the gate of the city and stone them both to death with stones. The lady because she didn't cry, being in the city, and the man because he humbled his neighbor's wife. So the man violated the other man's property by sleeping with his engaged fiance. The lady is blamed because in a city, if she had yelled, somebody would have heard her. And so if you didn't hear her yell, it must be because she wanted it.
So if it happened in the country.
That's the next.
Ding.
Oh.
That's the next paragraph, yeah.
But if the man finds the lady pledged to be married in the field, and he forces her and lies with her there, then only the man who lay with her shall die. To the lady you will do nothing. She has no sin worthy of death. If he found her in the field, the pledged to be married lady cried, and no one could save her. So she gets the presumption of being a victim. Right. She gets a presumption of having been the victim here because she was already engaged to someone else. Why would she want to sleep with this other guy? Such a bad idea. He must have been a rape in that case, and she is not to blame. Now we know that you can be threatened with a knife and you won't cry out in the city. Like this is not realistic to human experience. Right. Well, this is pre-tape, but you can understand that there are plenty of circumstances where this law is just not realistic or compassionate or whatever. Now, if a man finds a lady who is a virgin and who is not pledged to be married, he grabs her and lies with her, and they're found. The man who lay with her will give the lady's father 50 shekels of silver. She shall be his wife because he has humbled her, he may not put her away all of his days.
No divorce, get
No
out.
divorce for him.
No get out of free card.
Right. So he is being punished for this violation of the father's rights by paying a fine to the father, by having to marry the woman whom he has defiled, and he is never allowed to divorce her.
Okay, and
So
so
she's being punished.
And
Duh.
but no one cares,
the
because she's
man
probably.
who wrote this must have had experience to know that all these things could happen.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, case law and life experience, that's where these laws come from, I mean, there's a reason why many cultures have a law banning stealing or banning lying, you don't need a Torah or a God from Mount Sinai to create a tablet to tell you not to do this. You learn this from living in society with other people, and you put it in the mouth of the God. Right? It's like a big ventriloquist act. You make the God say it, but you learned it from your experience. So that's exactly what's happening here. This is sort of interesting that they have these different case scenarios and what will happen. But this last example is perhaps the most cruel example of the anti-Me Too-ness of the Torah. Because here's a case where this man has clearly raped a young girl, a virgin, someone who has not promised to be married in any way. He's penalized by paying a fine to her father, who was really her owner before, on the infringement on his rights. He's forced to marry her, which is thought to be a punishment for him, and he's not allowed to divorce her ever. And what happens to her? She is stuck married to this guy for her entire life.
And she can't get a divorce.
And she can't initiate a divorce. Only the man can initiate the divorce.
There's always poison.
Well,
And you think this guy is gonna be
there are
happy about this?
Yes, exactly. So, the challenge with these laws and understanding this as the foundational literature of Jewish culture is that we read this from our eyes and we are shocked and appalled and shocked. Now, I've chosen the negative stuff. There are some positive women characters in even the Torah. Miriam, for example, who was condemned in that interpretation, is a prophetess. She helps to lead the people. She makes sure Moses is safely found by Pharaoh's daughter, so she has some agency there. Later on, we'll read about Deborah, or we would read about Deborah in the book of Judges, who's very active and an agent. In fact, the general won't go out to war without her coming with him. He needs help from her. There's another prophetess in the book of Kings who verifies the authenticity of a revealed book. So there are positive women role models here, but they're always working in this universe of a patriarchal system. If you ever read the book of Ruth, which is traditionally read in the summertime during the holiday of Shavuot, you read about these women who are trying to negotiate a world where they are mostly powerless. They're widows, so they own no property. They can't choose who to marry next. They have to wait for the kinsman who's closest in line to give up his rights to Ruth, that if he wants to exercise it, he could marry her, whatever she wanted. They're operating within the system, and they're clever and creative and supportive of each other in the book, but we object to the system. We don't celebrate the heroes who are working in the unjust system. So when we read these stories in the Torah, it's okay for us to say, blech, we reject this. This is bad. Because sometimes we read our founding literature to find our values reaffirmed, and this reaffirms our values in the opposite direction by saying, this is part of my past that I have changed and gone beyond. I often will describe Jewish identity as an evolutionary tree, and you'll find similarities to yourself going back far up the tree. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do not oppress a stranger because you were a stranger in Egypt. Those are values that we share today. That's the opposable thumb. That's the erect posture. But the large frontal cortex, or the use of language, or the use of tools, maybe that's understanding women's rights differently, understanding sexual dynamics differently, understanding marriage differently. And that takes more evolution to get to. So if the Torah didn't show that stage of evolution in women's rights, understanding many of the objections brought up by the Me Too movement in recent decades, we are at a later stage in that evolution, thank goodness. And so we're allowed to read those past stories and to say, yay when it's good, but just like with Haman, to say boo if we reject those values.
But what's happening to the daughters of Jewish families who they go to Sunday school, they go to, is that why they are taught to have no self-esteem?
Well,
I mean, I'd be appalled to have my daughter taught this.
yes. Well, again, it all depends on how you're framing the story and what your vision of the ideal woman is. If you read the textbooks produced for Jewish girls in ultra-Orthodox settings, part of what's called the Beis Yaakov school system is one example, it reads like something out of the 1950s, because the goal is housewife, mother, have children, keep a kosher home, support your husband studying Torah. I mean, it's all it's a patriarchal system extended into modern life. And so they read these stories, and it fits in a framework that they're more or less operating under even today. Now, you won't find this in a conservative or reform setting where half of the rabbis are women, right? They're not going to read these stories with the same, acceptance of that patriarchal system that you would find in a more ultra-Orthodox setting. By the way, I'll point out that there are even some modern Orthodox synagogues that have women in clergy roles. They don't always have the title rabbi, but they're sometimes called a yoetzet halakha or decider of law. So even those communities are grappling with this question of Jewish feminism as they read these stories, but also as they understand Jewish law. And that's a good thing,
So do they rewrite them?
No, you have to read the story as it is. But our Constitution says that slaves are counted as 3/5 of a full person, even today, right?
It's not repeated.
Later amendments, right? There's a fugitive slave law provision in the original Constitution, not even an amendment. So the Constitution clearly accepted slavery. We find that appalling today. We amended it, we added later ideas but we didn't change the original language. It's still there in that source. The same is true, by the way, for the Massachusetts State Constitution, which includes all kinds of provisions for public funding of parochial religion. Modern-day Massachusetts would have nothing to do with that. But it's still if you look up the Massachusetts State Constitution, you'll find in those first few provisions all kinds of stuff about that we would find obnoxious on the separation of church and state issue, but that was felt to be core to creating a society that worked and an ethical populace. So we can have this as our sort of early literature, but we don't have to take it as fully binding. That's where the commentary comes in. And that's why it's also worth pointing out, people think that the Torah is Judaism. And the Torah is where Judaism starts. But Judaism is the rest of the Hebrew Bible and the commentaries and the way it was lived out over thousands of years. I mean, it's not just what it says on the page in the book. Just like the United States government is not just what it says on the paper in the Constitution. It's more than that, including several hundred years of history. So Jewish life today, I mean, the vast majority of Jews accept Me Too and reject some of these values in the Torah, but they're less willing to point out the explicit contradiction. We're more comfortable doing that, and even maybe making fun of it occasionally, or just expressing our revulsion at it. You'll find people more willing to, if not harmonize it, point out how it was slight progress, or read a favorable interpretation to it, as I mentioned some examples. Or sometimes they'll confront the hard text, and they'll say, this is a problem, and we have to grapple with it. And I think that's increasingly becoming the case, because as you get distance from the world of tradition that assumes it has to be true, over time you begin to admit this. It says what it says, and I can't get around that. I have to live with the hard stuff.
And thank goodness times have changed.
And thank goodness times have changed.
Sometimes it's good to look at it as a ruler to measure.
Right, look how far we've come. Yeah.
And yet we have plenty.
To understand, like I have some friends that were raised and intelligent women, but yet watching how they work their marriage and and I've never grappled with what I don't understand how, but if she was raised with this concept, it's embedded in her.
Right. Well, it's like what Betty Friedan wrote about in The Feminine Mystique. It's this gnawing question in your mind that just says, is this it? You know? Is this the most I can aspire to? And sometimes you don't even know to ask the question. It's she called it, I think, the problem without a name. You know? There's just some dissatisfaction with life that I don't know what to call it. But if that's all you've known, then that's all you've known. And that's where, I mean, feminism has achieved quite a bit, despite that cultural programming that people receive, but it took a while. You know, people today don't recognize how much things have changed from the 50s and 60s to the 80s and 90s, and then from the 90s to today. You know, I talked to my daughter's generation, and the kind of things that people got away with in the 90s, they find unthinkable, impossible. How could that have happened? Let alone what would have happened in the 50s or 60s.
I watched, you said Bad Men.
Yes.
And, you know, you're just watching this like it's, oh, I mean, not just how they treat it, but just, oh, you're leaving, have a drink, you know? But I realized at one point, my mother was working as a chemist in the 50s when that was really not done. And I was watching how they treated Peggy Olson in there. And all of a sudden it hit me like,
It was not attractive, and it was
but she was
so she's
trying,
competent
and she was
capable.
trying to not be a secretary. She's trying to not be something else. And I thought, oh God, that's what my mother probably dealt with.
Oh, for sure.
I'm shocked that she even got into school to be a chemist, because those positions were not really given to women.
Right. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think, was one of 6 women in her Columbia Law,
I would
or in
say
her Harvard Law
seriously,
School
had a
class.
professor come up to me and said, "You're too cute, and it'll take too long for you to go into medicine, so just pick something else."
Yeah.
That was, my mother wanted to go to medical school. And
Yeah.
the way, you
This
know,
is the closest she got.
Huh?
This is probably. the
well,
closest she got.
and you know,
Yeah.
there was timing. And you know.
So, again, this is not, maybe it's an uplifting topic, I don't know. You know, we're diving back into the depths of what was bad, but maybe the fact that we're so shocked by it, the fact that we find it so foreign is a good thing, that society has changed and the cultural norms have shifted so that what was acceptable is no longer. And that's part of the point of the Me Too movement as a whole.
And it's good that it's being voiced. But, you know, my sister posted something on Facebook this week, and it was reposting an article where a doctor this week denied a woman who's in pain painkillers because she was of childbearing age, and this painkiller could, you know, leave on
The fertility issues, right?
fertility issues, or, you know, and my sister posted welcome to Gilead. Now, of course, we're fortunate this woman can now go, she can go to another doctor, okay? You know, she's not, but.
If you have the money
But-
and the opportunity, I mean.
But we're in the US, and see, at this point, you can still go to another doctor, but the fact that someone did that this week, this is,
Well, just look at the legislatures in a lot of these red states and
Oh,
what they're doing. I mean, you know, people, even if you have a fetus that's not viable, you can't get an abortion in Alabama. I mean, you know, it's outrageous.
Yeah.
You know,
And again, they would harken back to a lifestyle of these values. These are Bible-belt, you know, communities.
yeah.
And so the idea of who has the autonomy to make a decision for a woman is part and parcel of these stories and that ethos.